Hello and welcome. We have met the enemy, and he is us. This quote from a cartoon by Walt Kelly in 1971 shows a character lamenting a sea of litter obscuring the forest floor. What does it mean? It's referring to the concept that mankind is the source of most of its own problems. In a broader sense, it also illustrates the ultimate futility of looking to apportion blame to others for things we perceive as problems. Instead, we are usually closer to finding solutions to problems affecting us personally or directly when we look inwards and seek to discover what role we might have played ourselves in creating these situations. Even more purposefully, we can look within to discern or devise ways we might use to extricate ourselves from difficult, even perilous situations. In the last video, we looked at different schools of thought concerning the law. For some, that may have seemed to be a dull, fusty process, full of quotes from hundreds or even thousands of years ago. However, regardless of how dull and uninteresting a study of history may seem, it is essential to know something of it before we can appreciate our current situation. Questions such as, how did we arrive where we are now? Why do we have the current system of government and laws? Why have there always been empires rising and falling throughout history? Why has there always been slavery in virtually every culture of which we have record? Why has every culture always had religion? Which organizations have caused the most harm, organized crime or governments? Is there in fact any difference between those two? What is the proper role of the individual in society? Is it to conform to stated norms or to seek to improve conditions in general terms for our fellows? Most people prefer, or say they do, to live in what they term freedom, which is in the absence of oppressive coercion dictating what they do, how they move, and how they dispose of their energy and generated income. A knowledge of history shows that relatively few have actually enjoyed such conditions, while most have been subjected to arbitrary tyranny affecting every one of the conditions just mentioned. Even in modern so-called free democracies, perhaps the only one of those which most could be said to enjoy is the choice of how they generate their income. And for huge numbers of those, that process involves doing something they'd rather not be doing, just to put food on the table. Famed spy novel author John le Carre stated, "There's one thing worse than change, and that's the status quo." The truth in this aphorism stems from the fact that no one or group has achieved a state they would term perfection. So it follows that there is always room for improvement in an individual's or society's conditions. To remain fixed in a status quo, then, is, by definition, to stagnate. This realization has been used by the proponents of legal positivism as justification for adjusting and tinkering with constitutional law by way of statute or edict. These learned people have found it relatively easy to convince the bulk of the population that reform is necessary. And who better to perform it than those who are deemed experts in the relevant field? The problem is that le Carre's statement omits to mention that change is not always for the better, and it can be argued that regression in one's condition is even worse than stagnation. For this reason, it is vital that any changes made must be according to sound principles, in accordance with the laws of nature, as an attempt to transcend those laws can only eventually lead to a loss of condition, which might range anywhere from tolerable inconvenience to outright disaster. We recall that the basic tenet of legal positivism, even as expressed by liberalist John Locke, is that law is suitably employed in a positive manner, quote, by the sovereign or supreme political authority of a community, end quote. This concept is in direct opposition to that expressed by Lysander Spooner, that any attempt to add or subtract from the upholding of simple natural law, to which all morally well-adjusted people concur, is, quote, an absurdity, a usurpation, or a crime, end quote. Also hidden in the legal positivist standard position, a hook embedded in the bait presented as a meal affording social decorum and stability, is the very concept of authority. The more we delve into the wrinkles of legalistic philosophy, the more contradictions we find. Is it not one of the foremost maxims of law that no one can grant or give to another that which they do not themselves possess? Kelsen illustrated this when he spoke of the Grundnorm, the ultimate accepted norm upon which any alleged chain of authority must rest. When we search the chain of alleged authority magistrates, judges, and others of the legal profession spruik as their sources of legitimacy, they invariably end at some point in statute law or some pronouncement of a renowned jurist. They never travel right back to the Grundnorm we, as the people, and the ultimate arbiters of law use, which is, of course, Magna Carta 1215, the primary document that prohibits the exercise of arbitrary power by any individual over another. Where Magna Carta is concerned, legalists argue incessantly that it is archaic, has been superseded, or is no longer relevant. They cannot say that it is invalid or has been repealed, because to do so would be to commit the crime of sedition. Thus, anyone compelled under threat of arrest to enter one of the treasonous fake corporate courts presided over by a magistrate or judge who attempts to point out the existence and validity of Magna Carta or the invocation of Article 61 of the same will simply be shouted down, their voice suppressed, exactly as was done during the notorious show trials held in totalitarian states like the Soviet Union or Communist China. One can only point out or question in such circumstances that the presider over such a court cannot possibly be impartial, being an employee of one of the parties to the proceedings, and that as to lawful authority they are impotent and possess only the power, not authority, to threaten and inflict physical violence upon their victims with the aid of costumed armed enforcers. Having behaved lawfully without belligerence and called out the criminality of those exerting unlawful power over our persons and property, it is likely that those enforcing the unlawful commands, having classified themselves as order followers voluntarily suspending their consciences and inflicting harm on fellow crown subjects for pay, will continue to break the law, believing in many cases that they are safe in doing so, because someone who knows more about this than I has instructed me to act this way. In situations like this, whether it be in a so-called court or with a police officer or other public servant, the best thing we can do is to simply keep reiterating the moral principles guiding our actions. We are entitled to protect ourselves from untoward harm, so many times we will simply comply under duress, having explained that the officer is forcing us to break the law, and peacefully compile our evidence of the treason and trespasses being committed against us. Thus, we have arrived at our current situation as a society, where we have a class of those claiming their right to rule over the masses, citing legality and law as their justification for doing so. When we analyse why or how this has happened, we are tempted to blame these oppressors and divide ourselves into an us and them dichotomy. They are doing this stuff to us. It's an easy trap to fall into. But how much of the problem is due to us? Many people, probably a large majority, readily accept the idea that there should be some form of authority over the community in general, and as far as maintaining law and order and redressing wrongdoings by individuals against each other in a just and equitable way, there is nothing wrong with that view, and supporting any judicial mechanism which sensibly administers the law. This is the origin and purpose of the Crown, which symbolises the ultimate base of authority, or what Kelsen would call the Grundnorm, for the lawful administration of justice in the Commonwealth we inhabit. However, taking that further and permitting certain people, because of their job status, to arbitrarily exact fines, fees, and various other penalties for activities which have caused no harm to anyone's person or property is absolutely not justified under the law of the land, which in our case is Magna Carta 1215. It is completely clear that no one has the right or authority to behave in this manner. Yet there is a class of people who do so. When we look to see why this is, the only possible answer is that the vast bulk of the population have simply allowed this system to be gradually imposed on us all. When we engage in quiet conversation with others, it's relatively easy to get their agreement that we actually live under natural law and should each have an equal say in what laws are drafted and administered. It's a much easier agreement to obtain than one about which statutes should be applied and which repealed or annulled, when the conversation would devolve into debates about legal precedents and how various vested interests will be affected and should retain preference over others, etc., etc. The only way this situation is going to change is when a significant number of the population decide that this nonsense must stop and stand up to state that volubly to this vaunting ruling class. That means capturing the thought processes of millions of people who acquiesce, however unwillingly, with this notion that there needs to be someone in charge. We're talking about hordes of those who say, when asked what they want from society, that they would simply like to live quiet, peaceful lives, enjoying their families and friendships and their simple pleasures. But if we're honest, is that what people really want? In every culture, at every point in history, there have been those who aren't content with such bucolic visions. These ambitious souls want lives of grandiose luxury, resplendent with the trappings of power, celebrity, and privilege. This requires much more energy and wealth than most will ever earn, so the wherewithal for such lives of opulence necessitates extracting it, preferably without risk of personal bloodshed, from the lives of many others. I'm not speaking of successful industrial magnates or entrepreneurs here, although these and the more parasitical ones, those seeking their goals from the political sphere, will almost invariably be seen hobnobbing together, and indeed have worked and are working even now to manipulate the political and judicial spheres of society to their own personal advantages. So those claiming that they were just like a quiet, peaceful life will have to awaken to the fact that such dreams can only be realized if one is prepared to, if necessary, fight for them. If we look upon life as would a beggar, hoping that our dreams will simply be granted to us by the rich and powerful, to whom we outsource our personal responsibilities in such matters as how much freedom we demand, we will find that life spares us only its small change, never enough to fully satisfy our hunger or slake our thirsts. It is not those who would be our overlords who are our worst enemies, but ourselves. It is us. The enemy is us. Those impositions where they currently lord it over society are there because they are willing to do what is necessary to gain an unlawful advantage. If we want lawful equality, we must do what is necessary to acquire it. The law is there, waiting for us to use it. We outnumber the opposition millions to one. They are more afraid of us discovering our power and using it than we are of them. They are, after all, cowards, as are all bullies. But if we never assert our rights and stand in our power of truth and integrity, then is it not arguable that we don't even deserve what is ours by right? We need to contribute to the struggle, not just stand watching from the sidelines. Seek every opportunity to raise the principles of natural law and justice in any discussion. These concepts must become commonplace in the communal conversation. In the words of Cassius to Brutus in Shakespeare's play, "Men at some times are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings." Later, Brutus says, "There is a tide in the affairs of men that, taken at the flood, leads on to victory. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. One final thought. Each human being is endowed with a certain amount of energy or power, which forms part of the overall energy pool of the species. Natural law teaches us that energy can never be destroyed. It can only be changed into a different form, either of energy or matter. When we don't use our energy for good, or allow it to dissipate, unapplied to some worthwhile purpose, it becomes usable by those who would put it to an evil or destructive use. We place it at the disposal of those who would diminish us. Do not do that. Thank you for watching.